Good evening, everybody. My name is Dina Cappiello. I'm the National Environment Reporter for the Associated Press, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the panel tonight, which is titled Questions That Should Be Asked: Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources in the Presidential Race. Tonight, this esteemed panel is going to be presenting questions that they would like to have asked of the presidential candidates, which looks like we have two these days, although not official, during the presidential debates on environment, energy, and natural resources issues. As I was thinking about this panel, that's kind of interesting. One of my jobs at the AP is to actually monitor all of the debates, and I've watched every single minute of every single one to fact check on energy and environmental issues, and I can tell you from many, many hours in front of the television with my laptop that the questions are few and far between this year, although you hear a lot about gas prices and production and energy and environmental issues in the press, but really the direct questions to the candidates have been pretty limited. Each person on the panel tonight has an area of specialized expertise. Each of you in the audience have a brochure that gives their biographical information, so I'll make very brief introductions so we can kind of get on the way with the panel. And you should also have an extract of the most recent issue of ELI's Environmental Forum magazine, and this contains an article where 12 major figures, including Christine Todd Whitman, the former EPA administrator, discussed tonight's topic and what they would have liked to see the presidential candidates asked. Now, let me just tell you how this is going to happen tonight. I have to be at a class at Georgetown where I teach environmental journalism, so I'm hoping to keep this timely. We're going to start out with 5-minute opening statements by each of the panelists about what questions they would like asked, and I'm going to ask them to justify those questions. Why, out of all the things you could possibly ask these people, that you would like to ask them these questions. Then it's going to be my turn to kind of probe them a little bit more and ask questions. And then lastly, and most importantly, we're going to turn it over to all of you to ask questions. Now, something I'm going to probably repeat more times than I want to tonight is that the goal of this panel is not to actually answer these questions. I know that the discussion may lead that way, but it is actually just to get the questions. And why we're doing this is because ELI is actually going to submit these questions to moderators of future presidential debates. This is not just us discussing it just to have an interesting conversation. This is actually going to be used, hopefully, in practice. And the first part of that process was the Environmental Forum piece. Tonight is the second part of that process, and so the input from the audience will help to shape those questions. And lastly, because I will get murdered by SEJ, which is, I'm a former board member of the organization, this event is being sponsored duly by the Environmental Law Institute and the Society of Environmental Journalists, which is a wonderful organization dedicated to the pursuit of solid environmental journalism. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the panelists, and we'll get started. The first is Don Elliott, professor of law at Yale Law School. This is not in the order they're seated, but Bob Deans, who we just spoke to today. Thanks, Bob. Gets me twice. Associate Director of Communications for the NRDC. Ken Green, resident scholar of AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. Jackie Patterson, who's Director of the Climate Change Initiative at NAACP. And John Cruden, last but not least, who's president of the Environmental Law Institute. And we're going to start this evening with Don Elliott.
Thank you. Well, my question is, how do we reprioritize in the environmental area? How do we have an honest debate about what our priorities should be and how they change over time? One of the things about teaching in a law school is it's like being Sisyphus. You know, you're pushing the same stone up the same hill over and over again. And you go back and you revisit the 1970s and the 1980s when most of our environmental laws were passed, and it was a very, very different time. We had just gone to the moon. We really felt that there were no limits on what we as Americans could accomplish. And we vowed to find a cure for cancer in 10 years and to eliminate all pollution in 5 years. That was the original mandate of the statutes. And one of the difficulties, this is the sort of the process question, which people find very, one of the things you learn is you're not supposed to ever talk about process. But one of the fundamental problems that we have in the United States as a lawmaking system is we have incentives to go out and declare new goals, but we really don't have any mechanisms to go back and reassess what we're doing and make mid-course corrections along the way. We don't have very good mechanisms to go back and say, this program isn't working very well, we need to change it a little bit, or this program has worked, we need to cut back on it. So I think that what I see is a lot of obsolescence in our environmental laws. I published a longer piece about this in the Atlantic, and unfortunately, you don't get to write your own headline. So they wrote a headline: "The Case for Trimming the EPA." Not at all what I meant, but it sort of frames things. I had actually said that we needed to reprioritize, and I think that reprioritize doesn't fit nicely into a headline. I used to be a headline writer, but that's really what I meant. I don't think that we are spending too much necessarily in the energy and environment area. I just think that maybe we're focusing on the wrong things. We're continuing to focus on chasing some very, very low risks in certain areas. We put the EPA essentially on autopilot and commanded it to pursue lots of very, very small risks, many of which probably don't even really exist under the modern understanding that there are probably biologically based thresholds for a lot of exposures to small amounts of chemicals. And I think a lot of the money and effort that we're spending chasing relatively phantom risks could be better focused on some of the things that I think all of us on the panel would agree are really compelling problems in the United States. So I won't get into answering it, although I did a little bit in my article, but I think we need a more honest debate about what our priorities should be in the environmental area. I think we need to go back and look at some of the programs, and based on my experience at EPA, where I was general counsel a number of years ago, once you create a program, it's very hard to ever scale it back. And I think many of our programs have continued forward despite their success. And I'm not saying we should eliminate them. I think we should applaud the success, but I think we need a mechanism, which many other countries have, to do a more honest job of evaluating how we're doing and shifting priorities from one area to another. That's it.
Thanks, Don.
That's what the pause was.
Next is Bob Deans.
Thanks so much, Dina. I started out in the journalism business 30 years ago, and my editor at the Charleston News and Courier one day, when I was being particularly cantankerous, said to me, you're all full of, gin and vinegar. He didn't use the word gin. He said, right now, but you can burn out just like the rest of us. And 30 years on, I'm beginning to understand what he meant by that. But elections, in the time that I've spent covering them here and abroad, it occurs to me, are not really about the candidates. They're about us. They're about who we are. They're about the choices we want to make as individuals and as a nation. The candidates themselves are mirrors that reflect that, and the one that reflects it with the most clarity tends to be the one who wins. Right now, there is a broad gap between what the public values in terms of environmental protections and where our politics are resting. And it is the job of elections to narrow those gaps. And so I would suggest to you as journalists that we have a tremendous opportunity in this election to try to help clarify and define these issues in a way that enables the electorate to do its job come Election Day and narrow that gap between what the public values and has valued for decades and where we are politically. And let me just be as precise as I can about that. Pew Research came out with a poll in February, found that 80% of the American people want our environmental safeguards to be strengthened or left alone. Now, what candidate is out there talking about doing that? The Republican-led House in the past year and a half has led the single worst legislative assault in history against the foundational environmental safeguards we all depend on to protect our environment and health. The American people did not ask for this, but somebody else did. The big polluters who spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year on lobbyists in this city and pumping up the campaign coffers of anybody willing to take a smokestack agenda up on Capitol Hill. Our questions need to go to that because that is the heart of the matter. Americans understand that money in politics is having a corrosive impact, as Theodore Roosevelt warned us against more than 100 years ago, on our politics, but rarely is it on display quite so vividly as it is in the environmental space, and that is responsible for this yawning gap between what the public values and where we are today. Bob Teeter, who was George H.W. Bush's political advisor, Bob Teeter told George H.W. Bush when he was president, environmental protections are a core American value. They have been ever since. But where is our politics on this? Our questions need to go to that. And I just want to very quickly, every election is a crossroads. We can't avoid using that word in our coverage. But we are at a crossroads in 4 key areas I would suggest to you with respect to the environment. First, our communities. Our homes, our farms, our ranches are under threat. Across this nation right now, communities are up in arms about hydraulic fracking in gas and oil like we have never seen before, and here's the reason why. We are drilling tens of thousands of wells to get at oil and gas and shale, and there is an enormous amount of oil and gas and shale. We are on the cusp of an epic boom that will be every bit as important as the Spindletop discovery was a century ago. Shale oil and gas, but our public oversight has not begun to keep pace with that. We need to ask very specific questions about what public safeguards do these candidates endorse to protect our communities, our ranches, our farms, and our watersheds from hydraulic fracturing. Number 2, our health. Asthma, bronchitis, heart disease, all of these things are affected by things like arsenic in our air, by soot. And yet, we have seen a pushback from Congress this year on the very rules and standards that can protect us from that. We need to ask very specifically where the candidates are on this. Are they going to stand up for clean air or not, yes or no? Our future. We have in this country a conservation legacy that goes back to Theodore Roosevelt. We have set aside 635 million acres of publicly managed lands in this country, national parks, wildlife preserves, and so forth. Again, going back for a century, Americans believe in these places. They're part of our identity. They're part of who we are as a country. Are we going to turn our back on that legacy, or are we going to stand up for it? One or the other. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, energy. We stand at 2 very distinct paths on energy right now. Because of the potential for shale oil and gas, there are people in this country now who say, relax, the fossil fuel age has just been given another 100-year lease on life. No, it has not. It has not, because the carbon that's polluting our atmosphere, the industrial carbon pollution that is fueling climate change that threatens us all, that's reaching deeper into our lives every single day, needs to be dealt with. And so, are we going to say this new shale oil and gas can be a boon to us if it's managed in a responsible way and if we keep our eye on the prize, which is a diversified energy future? Or are we going to just sit back and say fossil fuels forever? That's a specific question that needs to be asked of these candidates, and with that I'll conclude.
Thanks, Bob. I think I heard a few questions in there. Ken Green, you are up next.
Okay. Well, good evening, y'all. Thanks for coming out tonight. Maybe I'm too compliant, but I actually put together a list of questions for our presidential candidates. My goal, what I was thinking about this was, what is a question for? What's the purpose of the question? And I think, in my thinking, I would like to or to expose the values that are often implicit in things people say. So the questions I would tend to ask would be things like, on the environment, EPA points out correctly that Congress forbids them from considering cost in setting environmental standards. Critics have pointed out that those restrictions lead to very expensive policies and diminishing returns. Should we amend the Clean Air Act so that we can actually consider the cost of increasingly costly regulations? The question is it a unitary value? Do we basically have only environmental amenity values, or do we have multiple values, one of which includes economic growth and productivity? Another point I would say is because EPA doesn't assess proposals routinely for benefits and costs, they can't prioritize based on how much money they have. Shouldn't all agencies actually be able to prioritize their activities based on how much it costs them to get return on an investment? I mean, that's how we run things in my household. You'd think you'd want your agencies to be able to do that. A little possibly provocative question for the event, the campaign. EPA's Administrator Lisa Jackson now says that the agency's mission is as much about promoting social justice as it is about environmental protection. And she refers to actual environmental protection as legacy issues at EPA, whereas she's more interested in these cutting-edge issues of social policy. But was that why we had EPA founded, to deal with social policy and racial injustice? Don't we have other entities of government that can balance values better than a single unit value, essentially, entity like the EPA? On energy, again, I'd like to find out the values, which is Americans have long shown a preference for energy-intensive living. We like big cars, we like big houses, we like big TVs, we like powerful computers. There has not been a spontaneous market trend to smaller is beautiful in the United States. And the question is, environmentalists want to turn that around, want people to live lower energy lifestyles. So the question should be to the candidates, which is, do you support a free market in energy where Americans get all the energy they want at the price they want to pay, or do you support controlling how much energy Americans get and the price that they pay for it? So I could go on. I have other questions, such as whether or not it would bring down world oil prices. There's no question that producing our own domestic oil and gas would create a great deal of value just in terms of trade and employment. Are we going to capitalize on that in getting our economy going again? Or do we want to leave, as the environmentalists are saying, leave the coal in the hole? They actually want to leave coal in the ground and the value it represents in trade. And the same is true for Canada, which is whether it would bring the world oil price down or not. Buying oil from Canada, they turn around and 90% of what we send them in money comes right back to the United States in trade. They're our biggest trading partner. Using their oil and putting a pipeline would have immediate, essentially, trade benefits. Are we going to do that? And so I have more questions for you I can submit for the record. And the last one I'd say is environmentalists and economists are united in condemning ethanol fuel. I mean, the data is in. It's bad policy. It's bad for the environment. It's bad economically. It's just bad. Can't both sides agree that it's time to kill the ethanol mandates and get it over with? They cut some of the tax subsidies, but as long as there's a mandate to create an artificial market in fuel ethanol, it won't go away. The mandate is a subsidy. So I'd want to see, I would basically say, here's an area where you could possibly have bipartisan cooperation, is kill the ethanol mandate if you want to show some bipartisanship.
I have a lot of questions for you, Ken, that we'll get to later. The next up is Jackie Patterson.
So I've treated you all to writing out my notes so that I don't ramble incoherently for the whole time. So for some communities like Thibodaux, Louisiana, or Shishmaref Island in Alaska, and countries like Benin and the Maldives, they only have to look out the window at the encroaching shorelines and disappearing communities or countries to see that climate change is happening. Whether you're a family who has lost the only home you've ever known to Hurricane Katrina and were shipped off and dropped in Salt Lake City, Utah, or other places to start a new life away from all that's familiar, culturally or otherwise, or you're a child whose family was swept away in the flooding in Madagascar, leaving you in an orphanage in the care of strangers, you've encountered climate change, even if you don't call it by name. Pastoralists in Kenya and farmers in Illinois share common ground on the disappearing agricultural yields due to both drought and flooding. A colleague of mine, Elizabeth from Cameroon, who's a resident of the U.S., living right here nearby in Bladensburg, Maryland, shares a gravely sobering tale of her sister leaving Cameroon because the crops had dried up from the drought. Cynthia was in pursuit of what we all want for our families, resources to provide life-sustaining food and shelter. Driven from her country by this quest, she was attacked and raped during the insecurity of crossing the border. She now has AIDS as a result of that attack. With the prevalence of climate refugees on the rise, we must recognize that her story is not unique. As illustrated, for many, climate change is in our faces, wreaking havoc in our lives. For others, the impacts are there, but they haven't begun to make the connections to climate change. For all of us, the worst is yet to come, as evidenced by scores of studies conducted by renowned scientists around the world. Yet we have elected officials who have selected to who were selected to represent our interests, who are burying their heads in the sand, thereby leaving us in the crosshairs of an unmitigated climate crisis. If there was nothing we could do about it, I might be tempted to do the same thing. However, there is a lot we can do, and a lot that is already happening that we need to build on and bring to scale. We can shift from harmful energy production processes which result in the emissions that drive climate change, so that communities aren't being sickened by toxins, and jobs in toxic and dangerous environments are replaced by jobs that are safer for workers and for communities. Between 2009 and 2010, jobs in solar energy doubled, and opportunities increased significantly in wind, geothermal, and energy efficiency, and the expansion continues. With political will, we can have an energy portfolio that works for all. Just last month, the NAACP linked with a number of nonprofit organizations and churches in the D.C. and Maryland area, and through using our collective buying power, we solicited bids for our electricity business. Based on criteria such as low cost, local ownership, and proportion of energy that's supplied through clean energy, we all selected our energy supplier, Clean Current, which is a local organization based in Rockville, Maryland. Not only will NAACP be saving over $10,000 per year on its energy, all energy will be purchased through renewable and energy certificates for local and wind energy. We need elected officials and policies like renewable portfolio standards, net metering, subsidies, and investments in energy efficiency and clean energy that support these kinds of opportunities. Therefore, my questions as candidates build their platforms and plans for their offices that they're seeking are as follows. What are your plans to fulfill the moral obligation you have as a key leader of the world's largest superpower to address the scientifically proven existence of climate change and its current and future impacts? If elected, how will you ensure that climate change becomes a bipartisan issue? And if elected, how will you ensure that we as a nation make aggressive strides to ensure that our energy production does the least harm and upholds the civil and human rights of all, workers and communities alike? Thank you.
Thank you, and last but not least, John Cruden.
So President Obama famously said that elections have consequences. And I would say as well, what we're seeing right now has consequences as well. The buildup to the November election, what people say have consequences. Like so many of in the audience and on the panel, I've been in a number of different administrations, and you know what people do in the administration? They actually pay attention to what the candidates say, because when somebody is elected, they need to know what to do next, and so they look at that. So the questions that you've been hearing right now are actually enormously important, and I'm actually anxious at some stage, Dina, to hear from them, hear from the audience as to what they think. I want to do three things. I want to actually talk a little bit about why this should happen at all. Then I'm going to justify the questions I would propose to ask before I ask them. And then in my questions, I have two, a few of my own, but you have before you the latest issue of the Environmental Forum magazine, and I want to center on a few questions that of people who are not here, but that I honor and think highly of, and therefore I want to make sure that those questions are out there as well. And now, just for a second of personal privilege, Jackie, I just left the funeral service of John Payton, who was the head of the Legal Defense Fund of NAACP and a longtime friend. And if John was here, he would love this. He would love to see us rolling up our sleeves and mixing it up and debating and arguing. You could not have listened to this panel and think we're all in agreement. That can't be true. But he would love to hear the discussion and debate. So let me start as to why this is important at all by just a few lines from the Forum magazine, and this one by Congressman Sherry Bollard, a former board member of ELI and for a long time head of the Science Committee of Congress, who says, at the very least, the nation should emerge from the 2012 campaign with a clear sense of which ideas will drive environment and energy policy over the next 4 years. Personally, I hope we'll build on and learn from what has worked in the past. So no matter what you think the answers is, I think we should all agree these are the kind of debate we want. These are the kind of questions we want to hear from so that we can decide not only who we're going to vote for in November, but also what's going to happen the next 4 years. So that's my first, and that's why I think it's important. Second, I want to justify why you asked that at all. Why this is even important. One of the great things about ELI is we get polling data. We get some of the pollsters come in and brief us. I've pulled out now from the Gallup poll now that's just about a week old. Here are a half dozen things. Some of them are supportive of things that I would say. Some of them are not, but I think you ought to hear them. 73% of America's worries either a great deal or a fair amount about the environment. Over half believe that we are doing too little to protect the environment, and over half believe that the environment today is either fair or poor. 57% consider themselves either active or very sympathetic to the environmental movement. Only 11% are unsympathetic. 52% would expand nuclear energy. 65% would open up land owned by the federal government for oil exploration. 64% strongly support enforcing federal environmental regulations. 62% support higher auto emission standards for automobiles, and 80% support higher fuel standards. 65% support mandatory controls on carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gases. That is America today. Now, it'll change, but part of it today is today, and it's not irrelevant. I agree with the other panelists. I think everybody has mentioned somewhere energy as a topic that really has to come before the president. But I would articulate it maybe a little bit different. I would articulate it the way that Paul Allen does. He's the first article. If you pull out the first article you have in the Forum magazine, Paul is the vice president of Constellation Energy, but by the way, served on NRDC at one stage. And his opening sentence, now let me repeat it, but you can read it. The candidates should be discussing the vital and essential linkage between greater economic prosperity and enhanced environmental protection, both based on wise energy policy. Energy is not bad for the environment, it's good for the environment, but good energy practices should in fact accept good environmental protection. We simply must be in a sustainable environment. We need to ask that question, where are you going, what that will be with some degree of specificity. For decades, maybe more than that of our lifetime, the United States has been the leader of environmental protection in the world, not just the United States. When we celebrate Earth Day on April the 22nd, Earth Day was born here on April 22nd of 1970. We exported environmental protection to the rest of the world. My question would be, how do we regain that leadership that we had for so many years in environmental protection? I would ask the question that Mike Girard, a very distinguished professor now at Columbia Law School, asked, and that is, how would your administration make decisions on questions of science? We all talk about science, but what do we mean by that? Are you going to, in fact, make certain that in fact, your administration is dictated by good science? When the Council on Environmental Quality was created during the Nixon administration in 1970, one of the hallmarks of CEQ is they created an annual report on the state of the environment. And each year they did that for many years, and that has fallen off. I would ask the question, if you're president, would you turn to your chair of the Council on Environmental Quality and tell them, start that again? We want to see the baseline, good science, good statistics. We want America to know what they should know about the environment. Last, 78% of the United States is concerned about contamination of soil and water by toxic waste. What steps will you take to reduce that? You can. What will you do? Those are mine.
Thank you all very much. I'm going to frame my questions now that I've heard all that you've said, without trying to get you to answer them, but in which is going to be difficult for a journalist. But in order to kind of get them to be a little more specific, because I think that the devil's in the details here, and the devil is always in the interpretation of the question. And I think when Bob says something like "stand up for the Clean Air Act," that stand up probably means different things to different people, and I'm sure that you want them to stand up in one way, and other people want to stand up in the other way. So with that kind of as the background, my first question is going to go to Ken. You talked about amending the Clean Air Act to consider costs, and as someone who's covered a lot of the debate on the House floor in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of debate about cost estimates, and depending on who you choose, they're all over the map. And so I guess I'd ask you to kind of talk about and maybe rephrase the question in terms of, which cost, my biggest question there is, which cost estimates would you use? Because you have people that don't believe the EPA cost estimates. Industry has their own set of cost estimates. You have a whole bunch of think tanks that have different ones. So, that's really the $1 million question here is which one, what do you base it on without, again, say you did amend the Clean Air Act, without again getting into a partisan fight over which one is the right one and how you weigh that against the benefits.
Yeah. And in fact, the original question as I have it written out is, would you support amending the Clean Air Act and other environmental legislation to require mandatory independent benefit cost analysis of proposed regulations? I think you raised a very good point, which is that we don't have a standard methodology used for cost-benefit assessment, and we would need to have one. Ideally, I'm not a big believer in the whole that group makes right, but certainly some project of the National Academy of Sciences could develop a reasonably rigorous cost-benefit framework synthesized from the literature and say, this is going to be the core, and we'll audit you to this. You'd have an independent, you'd have some branch of the Government Accountability Office, et cetera, whose job it would be to say, are you using the established methodologies? Because, you're absolutely correct. I mean, EPA says essentially their benefits are so large that they equate themselves to one of the biggest job creation centers in the entire economy. And others say that EPA's benefit claims are so inflated as to be almost laughable. And so, some outside independent entity would be a way to go.
And then just an addendum to that, the next question is, okay, so you have an independent entity that comes up with some kind of cost estimate. Then who's to say how much cost is too much? Are you talking about a standardization of some kind of formula that for X regulation, when the cost exceeds the benefit X times, we choose to regulate, or can kind of...
Yeah. No, again, that's a great question. You'd want to ideally say, and they do this when you read studies that say drinking carbonated water gives you an increased relative risk of 1.2 of belching. It's a 20% increased risk. We normally say you wouldn't actually take it seriously until it's actually 3 times as high, right? So relative risk factors in the normal in the world of risk, there is a threshold, which is you don't assume something is real unless the study findings show that the risk reduction is 3 times, right? So you'd want the same thing, which is unless you can show a 3-fold benefit over cost, you shouldn't be regulating. Right?
And just, it's another clarifying question. I think it's a really interesting topic, as you probably can tell. But, a lot of the legislation that went through the Republican-controlled House, a only really considered one half of the cost equation, which was the cost of regulation,
Yep.
not the cost of emergency room visits,
Yep.
The health costs associated with air pollution. So are you talking about considering both sides of the cost equation, or only one? Or would you just amend the question to say to the candidates, hey, how would you consider costs? 'Cause that's obviously a really key question.
I guess what I was viewing it as benefit cost. So I think you have to look at both sides of the equation. It's the same exact situation as life cycle analysis for things. You know, what's the life cycle carbon footprint of a car? You have to draw the circle comprehensively enough to get everything in the question. I would just say, look, in our daily life, we make decisions based on costs and benefits. Just being here, I chose to be here. There were other things I could have done. I assessed the cost of being here, and I assessed the benefit of being here. This is the mode of human rationality, is cost benefit. When you go to a restaurant or you go to a hospital or you do anything else, why aren't we doing this with our lawmaking? And shouldn't we, as a country, shouldn't this be a basis of our a foundational element of our regulations, which is first show that you have more benefits than you're costing the American public, and then rank your resources accordingly. So if you could save 10 human lives for $1 with one regulation and save 1 human life for $10 with another one, don't do that last one until you've used up all the opportunities to do the first one. Right?
But, yeah, oh, sure. Hey, jump in.
Yeah, I don't want to hog the time. So,
Well, I agree substantially with what Ken said, and I talked about that in my contribution to the little forum piece that you have, and I also argued that we needed a new independent, nonpartisan evaluation process. We do have some processes that I think work pretty well, and I think it really goes to your question, Dina, that you can't debate the values or the policies until you get the facts straight. And interestingly enough, this goes back to Confucius. Confucius understood that. 500 years before Christ, he said you got to what he called the rectification of terms. That the most important thing to enlighten a political debate is to get the numbers and get the facts right. And we do have some institutions that do that pretty well, like the Congressional Budget Office of the National Academy of Sciences. One of the original purposes of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which I think actually is one of our statutes that works the best in some ways, is to get the facts clear so we could make these kind of policy decisions. One of the ironies, however, is that EPA has a statutory exemption from NEPA. It's the only agency to which this obligation to lay out the underlying facts is not doesn't apply to that agency. And I think as a result, what we have is the partisans, the people who have a particular stake in the outcome, trying to state the facts, whether it's industry or EPA justifying its rules. And there's this old expression that you're entitled to your opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And one of the things that we've got to do in the environmental area is have a better process to get the facts clear, because right now people, all partisans on all sides, are very good at essentially misstating the facts. And if you misstate the question, there's really no hope of getting the answers correct.
Bob, would you have something to add?
Yeah, just quickly, I appreciate anyone who brings Moynihan and Confucius together in one response. That's excellent. I just make 3 quick points. One, every regulation follows a statute. That's why there's limited latitude in terms of cost-benefit analysis when you create the regulation itself. It is supposed to reflect the law that Congress passed. It has to do that. But in the implementation and enforcement of the law, there is a lot of latitude for cost-benefit analysis, not only by the EPA, but before any major regulation is approved, it must go through the Office of Management and Budget and the Office of Cass Sunstein, who now takes a very hard look at cost-benefit analysis. And the final point I would make is that while industry is, by definition, expert at coming up with cost-benefit analysis, otherwise the companies would go out of business immediately, it is much more difficult to put a price tag on the value of clean air, clean water, clean lands, healthy wildlife, benefits that we all enjoy. So the table is not level, but to imagine somehow that cost-benefit analysis is not part of the equation, that's not how it works, and it never has been.
You know, I really do disagree with that as a former general counsel of EPA. There are a number of statutes. It's not uniform. You're absolutely right. There are some places where cost-benefit analysis is allowed, but there are many, many statutory provisions, like Section 109 of the Clean Air Act, setting national ambient air quality standards, Section 112, air toxics, where that is specifically prohibited. So, I mean, I think this is a good example of we got to get our facts straight before we can have a dialogue about this, because there are some places where it's permitted. There are other, and when I talk about putting EPA on autopilot or not considering other things, that's exactly what I'm talking about. There are many, many statutes where back in the 1970s, Congress said, you're right, Congress said it, we're not allowed to consider any of the countervailing considerations. We're not allowed to strike a balance.
But I think it is a fair question to ask a presidential candidate or candidates, what is your position on how and should we apply cost-effective analysis? That's a fair question to ask. That said, that said, though, there's reasons why Congress, in fact, did not allow cost in some of our health-based statutes. There's a reason why if you walk out of the press club and get hit by a car, you would not want your lawsuit to be determined on a cost-effectiveness basis. There's a reason why when you turn on the water out of your tap, you just want to know it's good. You don't want to know that's cost-effective what they did. You just want to know it's good. But it's still a fair question to ask, isn't it? It's a fair question. What is your position? And then we grade how they ask to determine whether or not we vote for them or not.
And the how, I think, is essential there, John. I mean, that's what I was getting to is not only do you think it should happen, but how you think it should happen. Right. Going again to kind of trying to get you guys to narrow and be specific to these questions. This one is for Don. You started off, you said, how do we prioritize in the environmental area, which is a huge question. And you hinted to specific statutes in some of your justification, but I'm going to kind of put you on the spot here, and I would like to kind of hear from you what specific areas you would like to ask the candidates about in terms of the statute, whether it's a Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, RCRA, what have you.
That's great, and that's a very fair question. I think one of the things that I did really hear that there was a consensus on the panel about is clean energy. We need more clean, affordable energy in this country. Everybody kind of agrees on that goal. Many of our environmental statutes prohibit EPA from considering the energy effects of its regulations specifically. Don't allow it, John. It's not getting hit by a car. I think we spend much too much chasing very small risks at Superfund sites. This is just EPA's unfinished business report from 1987. We get almost all the risk reduction benefit when we do the removal for about 10% of the costs at the front end. And on the other hand, I think Jackie and others make a very strong case that climate change is really, really important, and we should be spending more time on that. It's very easy to talk about the rhetoric of, we ought to protect workers from toxins and things like that. But when you actually do the hard work of analysis, you're confronted with the very unpleasant truth of scarcity of resources, and you can't do everything, so you have to try to prioritize for where you get the biggest benefits. We got about 70% of our benefits, of our health benefits, from clean air. And all the other programs at EPA get the other 30%, because these things are really driven by the amounts of exposure. So if you look at it, if you look at these programs, it's not really very hard to go through, one by one, and say where you're getting the big benefits and where you're spending a huge amount of money for virtually no benefit at all. And this has been done over and over again. And there's a strong consensus about it. And I agree with what Bob said, that Congress did this. But my point is that Congress did this in an era where we really thought we could do everything, where there was no sense of scarcity or limits. And for 20 years, EPA, I think, has done a really masterful job of focusing on a lot of programs where we get a substantial benefit for the money that we're spending. But it's a low-hanging fruit problem. Over time, we're running out of many things and we're being forced by the statutes to devote huge amounts of resources to chasing risks that are really very, very low and probably don't even really exist.
So I want to disagree with Don, take an opportunity to disagree with Don. I don't think, if you were talking about this panel and saying the consensus of the panel is about affordable energy, I think you would be wrong. And I think this is how I would narrow this question with regard to presidential candidates, which is your Secretary of Energy went to Congress and said that keeping prices low for energy or gasoline is not a priority. The public thinks that it should be a priority if you look at the way they react to gas prices. So I would ask a very specific question. What specific, first of all, is it going to be your goal of your administration to keep energy prices cheap as possible? And if so, how are you going to go about that? What means will you employ to bring energy prices down and keep them there so that people can flourish, essentially?
And Mark Udall, who also wrote in the Environmental Forum, and the Senator Mark Udall would ask the question, what would you do? Do you support renewable energy standards? What do you think of that question?
Yeah,
by the way, he's on our board, so say something nice.
Well, I should also plug myself. I'm in that forum as well, so thank you for giving me an entry in there. I'm in good company, and I think that's a good question. You have to narrow it. So, many states have renewable energy standards. Do you support a federal renewable energy portfolio standard? I think that's a critical question that should be asked. In fact, I mean, it's absolutely vital for describing the future direction of the candidates. And
I want to go back, though, to what
that wouldn't be a spontaneous market, though.
I want to go back to this expression that Ken uses about cheap energy. And this phrase, cheap energy sort of rolls off the tongue. But I assume that you mean, Ken, that we should include the full costs, that we should internalize all of the harms and show them in the price. And you mean what's really cheap, not necessarily what appears to be cheap with a false price signal, right?
Yes, of course. I mean,
okay.
And then furthermore, let me go beyond that and say, I think that what I believe in is that we should. Do you trust? That's the other question I would ask the presidential candidates: is do you or don't you? Do you trust energy markets or do you not? I think the question is: do you believe energy markets will provide you with the optimal level of energy at price and effects, including environmental ones, or do you not? And that's a difference the stark difference in ideology that would be illuminated because clearly they're in different directions.
But I think, as you well know, there's been a lot of work, including by ELI, about the huge subsidies that we have for fossil. And the biggest subsidy that we have for fossil is all of the people who die from exposure to the pollution. And so you have a situation in which people make a market choice and they buy a form of energy that appears to be cheaper, but they buy it based on price signals that are distorted. So one of the first things you're going to have to do if you want to have cheap energy is you're going to have to figure out some way to internalize the costs. If you can't and that's a point that lots and lots of people have made. But if you can't internalize the costs, if the price signals are screwed up, then maybe in a second best way, you have to start trying to encourage the development of some sources of energy that you have reason to believe don't have these large externalities associated with them. So this problem of what is cheap energy is a really it's a very misleading term, I think.
I think
it's a good question.
We could hash this question out for hours, because you can point to other economists who point out that when everyone's in the system, essentially some things are what are called pooled externalities, or essentially like gym costs. Everybody bears the cost. Everybody bears the problem, and so it's internalized inherently. People bear the consequence. Therefore, it's internalized.
Well, let me give you a concrete example.
They're called club costs.
Well, I'll give you a concrete example, which came from a report by the National Academy of Sciences called "The Hidden Costs of Energy," and I was on the Board of Environmental Studies and Toxicology, under whose auspices this was done. And what it shows is that when you even leaving aside climate change, because they couldn't estimate that, right, but just on the conventional costs, wind power was cheaper than coal. That is, it appears that coal is cheaper than wind per kilowatt hour, but that's because there's a big health cost subsidy to coal, which makes it appear cheaper. And this is not just me, this is the National Academy of Sciences in a study that was funded by Congress called The Hidden Costs of Energy. So one of the things we're going to have to do, and this is what I mean by Confucius and rectification of terms, you know, if people are continuing to buy something because it appears to be cheaper, but it's actually causing more harm, then we've got distorted price signals. We got to fix that.
Well, here's a question to come out of it.
Last comment, then we're going to go to the audience.
A question, not a comment. The OMB says that American taxpayers are subsidizing the oil industry to the tune of $4 billion a year. The oil industry made $137 billion in profits last year. Is it time, once and for all, to get the oil industry off the backs of the American people after 100 years, yes or no?
With that, I'm going to turn to the audience. So I think that we all. I think I know what one would say. There are microphones that are wandering around. Please use a mic because we are recording the session. And then just a reminder that the goal, I know it's a tough one, is to prompt other questions and not answers to those questions as you pose queries to the panel. Anyone, there's microphones.
Hi, I'm Bob Irvin. I'm the president of American Rivers. I have a question that I would pose that would, I think, highlight the candidates' views of federalism, views of clean water, views on energy development. It plays off of what Bob mentioned about fracking and the booming natural gas industry and the impacts on community water. One of the reasons that this is occurring is because in the Bush administration, under Vice President Dick Cheney's Energy Task Force, the natural gas industry obtained an exemption from the Safe Drinking Water Act and also from the Clean Water Act, not enjoyed by other energy extraction industries. And so the question to the candidates is, do you support the continuation of that exemption, or would you want to see it repealed so that the natural gas extraction is subject to the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, same as other energy development?
Yeah, I'll comment on that. I agree with that. I think that's important. I'd take it a little bit further. You know, one of the problems with fracking is that when you bring in these huge quantities of the fluids, they have a lot of methane that is dissolved in them, and this is typically just vented off. And methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. So, I mean, talk about something that's real easy to control, that has big benefits. It's just a matter of requiring that methane be captured. And I think that and there's actually a study by a man named Horvath at Cornell that purports to show that the gas is actually more harmful than coal to climate change if you vent off all this methane, which you don't have to do. So I think the fracking industry and the natural gas industry would be very well advised to have some modest regulation that can reassure people. I think one of the things that people in industry often don't appreciate is that government regulation can be helpful in reassuring the public that your product is safe, and in the long run, I think they run the risk of getting some significant bans and significant public, and people in Europe often understand this. They talk about your social license to operate, and if we don't have some of the kinds of regulation you're talking about, I think in the long run it's going to be very difficult. We're going to see a lot of bans on fracking and so on. I think it's fundamentally a very safe and good technology, but I do think it needs to be reasonably regulated in order to make sure that it's safe.
I think I completely agree with Bob Irvin's question. I think it's a great question. I rather agree, if I was asking myself, Bob, I would probably ask it slightly broader, in the sense that This is a dominant energy environment issue right now. Fracking has other issues. I think I would want to know from the presidential candidate, what steps would you take to make sure that the production or creation of natural gas by fracking is environmentally protective? Because it, as Don said, it has methane issues, it has water quantity issues. The dispersants that are used, the disclosure of those chemicals is, I think, important so that we understand all of that. But I think still asking that particular question, I think, is a good one.
One interjection. I would ask the question: how do we determine the hazards of fracking and control them, independently of existing environmental statutes? Let's not forget the Clean Water Act, the Drinking Water Act. Those statutes were not written to address this risk. Those are older statutes that were looking at completely disparate risks. So to ask the question, why are they exempted from it? Well, they're drilling 4 and 5 miles deep. The water tables are only a couple of 100 feet deep. The determination was that they're operating so far away from the water tables they wouldn't pose a threat. Even if they did, the act might not be responsive to the genuine risks we face now. So a better question is, how do we assess the risks and how do we manage them while keeping the benefits of moving forward? Let's not forget, natural gas is vastly cleaner than coal. It's vastly cleaner than oil if you were to use it in your car. And so there are many environmental benefits on the table as well as potential costs that
I
have
do
to be
not
considered.
disagree with you, Ken. I just have to make one quick observation, and that is when the Deepwater Horizon trial restarts and the United States case against BP continues, it will be the Oil Pollution Act and the Clean Water Act. And it's for the underwater hydraulic fracturing that occurred there.
And I would just say, great question, Bob, and I would follow up and say, drawing on the lessons we've learned from our oil and gas experience over the past century, are there special places that need to be taken off the table completely to the risk posed by fracking, and specifically watershed areas, the Catskills in New York City, other places?
Excellent. Other questions from the audience?
Thanks. I'm Ivy Main, the Virginia chapter of the Sierra Club. I work in energy, so to me that's the most important thing ever. But I think I was really pleased that Jackie Patterson focused on climate change. I think the first question on any list of environmental issues that should be talked about with the presidents is ask them, do they agree that man-made climate change is happening? I mean, that we are responsible for what's going on? Because I'd like to know. I think I know the answer for one of the candidates, but I'm not sure I know the answer that the other one will give, and I'd like to know if we're dealing with a fact-based candidate here. So I think that's a really critical starting point in any environmental discussion, because if it's all going to just be rhetoric, then we should know that up front. The other question is a little harder to frame, but it has to do with natural gas, which is even setting aside the fracking issues, it is killing renewable energy on an economic basis. I mean, it's killing coal. That has stopped more coal plants now than the Sierra Club has. But I wish it weren't true, but it really, cheap natural gas is killing everything, and it is totally decimating renewable energy. And the interesting thing is, if you start looking at the statistics of how long will this natural gas boom last, it's not at all clear that it lasts the life of a natural gas plant. So we have economic incentives for utilities to build now, to use natural gas now, and that may not last long enough. So if we're talking about what's good energy policy, there's a very strong case to be made, I'm making it all the time, that you should be balancing your natural gas investments with renewable energy investments. I'm not sure how to phrase the question. I think it has to do with the future of going forward. How do we ensure reasonably cost-effective energy? Cheap, I think it's a loaded question. But certainly, how do we look long-term at what is in our national interest in energy, taking into account the fact that we've got this cheap natural gas, but also have got to be transitioning to renewable fuels for the future of the country, the economy, and the world.
Anyone want to take a stab at
Yeah,
that?
I would offer one comment, which is regrettably the track record of predictions in the energy space. If you're an energy wonk like I am, you've read Václav Smil and the other guys who read energy. The people who predict future energy supplies have a 100% track record of failure, which is right. We do not get this right because no human being has the knowledge to predict the future. 5 years ago, as we were talking earlier, we were talking about liquid natural gas terminals that we had facing in the wrong direction because we assumed we were going to be importing, and now we're looking at exporting. And that's only 5 years. The renewables, the investment time horizon for things like gas plants or nuclear plants or whatever are, as you know, 40, 50 years for payback time. And so I think that's a great question, and that gets back to the question I asked earlier, which is, do we go with markets and trust in the resilience of markets, or do we try to plan and hope we can outperform previous efforts of planning? And I think that will reflect certain innate beliefs of how you should structure your government and how we should structure our energy policy. But improving our ability to predict would be nice, but I just don't believe much in predictions, so I don't see we're going to get there.
I do think that this is a really excellent question. Both of these questions are really excellent questions because I think they do reveal a lot about a candidate and what their approach would be. I mean, I've got my own answers. Just one little factoid, and that is that in the 1980s, when it wasn't this big supply of natural gas, it was just predictions of natural gas by the Department of Energy. U.S. utilities took write-offs on natural gas plants larger than the savings and loan crisis. So I mean, we've had huge mistakes in the past, and I think that what that counsels is you have to have a diversity of sources, and we are probably the country in the world that's best positioned to do that. We in the United States are either blessed or cursed with huge resources of energy, both fossil and wind opportunities and hydro and so on. Many countries in the world, they really only have one energy source or no energy source at all. And part of our problem has been that we have so many that we tend to lurch back and forth from one to the other. But I agree with you that renewables have a role to play. The difficulty is how do you do it? And I think that a lot of it has to do with internalizing some of these costs. I mean, one of the reasons that coal or natural gas appears cheaper is that we have all of these unpriced externalities that make the wind plant look more expensive than it really is. And you have to begin to get the numbers right if you're going to rely on a market system. I mean, there's no point in having the market make these decisions if all the prices of things don't reflect the real social costs. So that I think is the first step.
So I'm hearing from the panel and also from your question that really kind of what the question is how do you ensure that diversity in the future, right? Because there's a lot of talk about not using incentives, right, to help out certain power forms that are right now economically at a disadvantage to natural gas and some other forms of energy.
And I think I would ask the question this way on climate. It's hard to improve upon Jackie's question, but I think I would say to Governor Romney, you said as governor that climate change was a problem. Is it still? And if not, how did we fix it? I think the question on renewables. The question on renewables basically is, do you believe that as a nation we are good at identifying national goals and assembling national resources around them? Do you believe that played a role in, for example, winning World War II, winning the Cold War, putting a man on the moon? And if so, do you believe that should be employed in the single largest economic challenge facing the country over the 21st century, which is our energy future?
Dina, I mean, I think that would make an interesting question as well that we agree on, which is. We're hearing now that the old argument over industrial policy is new again. Previously, the consensus was industrial policy doesn't work. Now the argument is industrial policy can work. Do you believe that industrial policy works or doesn't work? because that's, I think, a very important issue to debate right now, which is the difference between our research, investment, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that's the key argument, which is planned economy or non-planned economy, industrial policy or non-industrial policy. Again, it would be a very sharp razor, I think, that would divide your candidates.
Right, you could say, do you think experts or markets are smarter?
Yeah.
And I bet you get different answers from the two candidates.
Sure,
Exactly.
and they would be interesting ones. By the way, I am sort of less interested in the view of either of the candidates, whether or not they believe climate problems exist, because I consider that to be a scientific question of which they should defer to scientific experts on. I'm actually quite more interested as to what they will do with that problem if they should be so lucky to have either a second term or a first term.
Another question from the audience.
Scott Shang with ELI. Thank you for the excellent thoughts. I also hope we have time to get lots of questions from the audience in. I had two questions. One, kind of riffing on what Ken and Don were talking about. Would you support requiring a mandatory independent environmental impact statement for all actions, public or private, with a potentially significant level of impact on public health and the environment? And second, do you believe that environmental pollution burdens on public health are borne equally within the United States? And if not, what would you do about it?
I mean, the first one's interesting. It's an interesting question. I was just in Canada a week or so ago looking at the oil sands. The government of Canada brought a bunch of think tank people up there. And we learned a fascinating thing about social license in Alberta, which is they regulate, they visit every single oil sand facility every year with teams of environmental auditors. And they do this despite the fact that they know from their surveys of compliance, they have 98.6% compliance in all sectors of industry in Alberta. So they could easily go to these sites and say, we're going to check you every third year, we're going to check you every fifth year. So your first question was if you have a 98.6% compliance rate, why would you want to impose the expense of having to, every single initiative you want to undertake to expand a plant or whatever requires an environmental impact statement? There's some line there where they're buying social capital by doing that. And I said, you have to know that's wasteful of resources. And they said, yes, and we're buying social license. We view this as buying social license. So, I think that's an interesting question, but how do you justify regulating everything? I would change that question to say, we used to have a presumption in the United States that if you wanted to do something, you just went ahead and did it without permission. Now, the question is, we're saying before you can do anything, you have to get permission from the government. Does that reflect sort of the direction you want to see the country go in? I think that would be another clear illumination of differential
Just to be very clear on that, I didn't say that at all. An environmental impact statement is not government permission to do anything. It's a statement. And if it's done by a public entity who's using, if it's done by a private entity who's using public resources for their own good, I think they owe it to the commons and to the public to tell us what they're going to do, what they're going to do with it. It's our common good. It's our grandkids' future. Just tell us what you're going to do.
I particularly like the question that goes to environmental justice, the second question that you raised. Is the price of environmental degradation borne equally by all of us around the country? Because you don't have to look far, as we heard from Jackie. Some of us who've been down in the Gulf of Mexico a dozen times since the oil spill can attest. It is not borne equally. We have sacrifice zones that we've created in this country for the sake of our energy. It goes to the externalities that Don talked about. So I think that question would be very provocative. It would be very interesting to hear the response of that, and it would be very interesting to hear what a candidate would propose in terms of dealing with those inequities.
Other questions?
If I might, Tom Lorenzen. I want to see if I can pose a question that might actually satisfy both Ken and Bob. So let's see if we can do this.
You should run if you can.
Well, let's just see if we can get there. I want to build on a question that Ken asked, which was about the low-cost fuel and the very clear public interest in low-cost fuel, but also on what Bob said, which is about the Pew survey results, about the very high interest in our environment, clean water, clean air, and so forth, if you ask the public about that. So here is the way I would frame the question. The public is clearly interested in low-cost fuel. Pew survey and other surveys also show that the public has an abiding concern in the environment. Do you view these as in irreconcilable conflict? If so, why, and which takes precedence? If not, What policies would you adopt to ensure both?
Good question.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. This gets to a word which we no longer use in environmental discussions for some reason, which is balance. Where do you strike the balance between environmental protection and economic growth? And the reason we no longer have that discussion is because for a long time it was intentionally thrown out. There was the rallying cry from the environmental side was, well, there's not a trade-off, and the reality, of course, there are trade-offs. But so I think that question of how do you get to the trade-offs of cost versus environmental impact is an important one. I don't know that
I want to comment on it too.
we're likely to agree on it, but
I think one of the difficulties is that some of these terms like we use, like the environment or stand up for clean air, they're not unitary. When you do a regulation that prevents real harms that are larger than what the regulation costs, you're actually benefiting the economy. On the other hand, when you spend a great deal of money to do something that doesn't have very tangible or real benefits, you're hurting the economy. But both of those things can be encompassed under protecting the environment or clean air. So it's a much more subtle and complicated thing because these are not unitary categories, even though we have a single word for them. There's a whole bunch of different programs and policies together, some of which are very good for the economy. I mean, we have many regulations that prevent 10 or even 50 times more harm than they cost. Those are good investments. It's where you are spending a huge amount of money that doesn't produce much benefit that you're really stealing from the poor, and that it gets expressed in terms of in ways that people can't really trace out. But the reason that people don't have economic opportunities are because in some instances we're siphoning off money that could be better spent in other ways. So it's a question of how you prioritize, how do you have a process that makes good investments and doesn't make bad investments.
I think you also have to clarify the question a bit because polls, I mean, the question really is, are Americans half as schizophrenic as they seem to be based on polling? And polls are not all alike. So the poll that I get when I go to the gas station to buy gas that I answer with something out of my wallet, that's very, very concrete. The general question, how highly do you rank environmental values, is wonderfully abstract. And so the question is, sort of, the only poll that really matters, of course, is the one that's coming up in the election, because that's what people are theoretically voting their, both the concrete and the abstract.
But Ken, I think Tom's question is diabolically clever. Because I do not see a presidential candidate standing up and saying, actually, I do not support environmental protection. I just do not see that. Similarly, I do not see any candidate standing up and saying, no, I actually would like your gas prices to raise. That's what I don't see that, either one. And so what Tom, because I think what I said is true, what Tom's question drives you to is your balance question. We would love to have a presidential candidate and stand up there and say, here's about the way I see this playing out during the first 2 years of my administration. Yeah. We would love to hear that. And that's why I like your question, Tom, because I thought it was clever.
Other questions from the audience?
There's one down here in the front, Chandra.
There's one in the
There's
front,
a couple
too.
over here, yeah.
Thanks. Very interesting. Michael Blumenstock, just graduated from Johns Hopkins University, environmental science and policy. You probably know right now we're witnessing the 6th greatest extinction on the planet. We are causing it. I think my question, I guess it's sort of a loaded question, is when are we going to stop being this sort of anthropocentric viewpoint, saying humans, we are the ones who are most important? When you drive up any highway these days and you see forests being denuded to make shopping centers, I don't see environmental protection. I don't see environmental protection when you've got more cars on the road. I mean, you're filling up your gas tank with a carcinogen, gasoline. It's hypocrisy. And I think the greed has to stop, the corruption, the amount of money that's being made to profit industry, the environmental injustice, like you talked about, Jackie, earlier. I mean, the Cancer Alley, petrochemical alley in Louisiana, Texas, where you've got petrochemical refineries. You don't see the Exxon executives living in these places. They're living on their 5,000-acre ranch in Montana, taking all their money and sending it off to the Cayman Islands. I think until we, as humans, realize we're just one species on this planet, no better, no worse than any other species, the environmental degradation and destruction will continue. I think what I'd ask Mr. President is, when are we going to stop going down this road?
I like the question, and I think one way to phrase that is, what is the one thing you would like to tell your grandchildren in 30 years that you stood up for as the most powerful person in the world? And you would get a sense of where the values lie.
Hi, my name is Leonard Wayne. I'm an independent researcher, so I don't have an affiliation. My background is I have a bachelor's in physics from UC San Diego. Both of the presidential candidates, neither of them seem to understand that climate change is irreversible. And I'm wondering if the people asking the questions understand that it's irreversible.
You know, the problem that journalists have here is almost existential. You're required to be, you know, what we think of, I hate to use the word fair and balanced, it's been somewhat adulterated, but you're supposed to be giving equal weight to both sides. And yet those who look closely at climate understand that to give equal weight to both sides is to amplify by many-fold one side. And so that's the problem that journalists have in approaching this, because when you know that whatever it is, Don can probably tell me, 97, 98% of the scientists who understand climate science agree that it's a problem, we're contributing to it, and we can do things to arrest it. You don't want to sort of give equal weight to the 2 or 3 outliers who say, oh, no, not at all. And so that's the issue journalists have in conducting this. But I think that's the beauty of Ivy's question, is when you just flat ask the president on the record in front of the cameras and in the lights, do you believe climate change is happening, that we are partly responsible for it, and that is a threat to the country? And we know that when that question, exactly that question, was put to the House of Representatives a year ago, not a single Republican voted in the affirmative. So if Mitt Romney says anything but that, you have a lead.
Or better yet, do you agree with the vast majority of scientists who believe that climate change is happening?
I would add as a corollary to that, though, because we're constantly talking about the impact of communities. Bob laid that out in his fourfold test, and I think I would ask as well as I could. Maybe this would be a second tier, but not an unimportant question for me is, how will you help communities and countries across the world adapt now to climate change impact? We may well be beyond just mitigating. How will they adapt? And how will you help them adapt?
Hi, Alana Shore with Greenwire. I just wanted to maybe break from the format a little bit as a journalist myself and follow up on something that John said a few minutes ago, which is that he doesn't think he's heard a presidential candidate say, I'm against environmental protection, or one say, I want to raise your gas prices. In fact, Newt Gingrich did campaign on abolishing the EPA and replacing it with the Environmental Solutions Agency. So I don't know if that's necessarily true. And the second part, Republicans are certainly getting a lot of mileage out of casting Stephen Chu's inaugural comments on gas prices as stating that President Obama actually does want to increase gas prices. And they're making headway with this message. So not to say that neither of those are true, but I don't think either of those are true, which leads me to my question for the panel. Particularly directed at Mr. Green and Mr. Deans, because you represent oftentimes two sides of an increasingly bitter dialogue. To what degree do you feel like the bitterness, record highs of this year in terms of the partisanship and the misstatement of facts, oftentimes, as Professor Elliott put it, is hurting this campaign? Do you think it can change? how would you change it as people influencing the dialogue?
Well, I don't think I don't think it's good. Let's put it that way. I don't think the polarization particularly bodes well for the status of our country or its discourse. I also don't see much prospect for fixing it, and the reason, of course, is that politicians do respond to polls. Even the administration has basically walked away from the phrase climate change. I mean, it's been noted extensively by environmental groups that if you ask to that question of both of those candidates, it's unclear to me that you'd get a straight-up answer from the president any more than you'd get a straight-up answer from Mitt Romney, because nobody wants to discuss it. And that's a reflection of some of those polls, which is that when you ask people what's important to them, environmental issues rank low, and climate within environmental issues ranks even lower. So I don't think you're gonna get the answer to those questions from either side.
How do we rephrase the question? Let's take the word climate change off the table, and let's rephrase the dialogue.
Well, I think a point made earlier was okay. Let's even skip the science question. What can be done? What do you think can be done? I think you'd be better off just tabling the science question and saying, let's not ask if it is or it isn't, real or whatever. Let's just say people want less CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. They want less greenhouse gases. What would you do? And see how the candidate responds to that, because I think that's it's a more interesting question. Okay, if the science. Well, by the way, I'm a scientist by training, so I don't have a problem with the science of climate change being real and greenhouse gases being heat retaining gases and the like. But I do think the most important question is, what are you going to do about it, and how much is it going to cost, and what trade-offs are involved? Because I think that's why climate change negotiations are broken down around the world. It's why more and more, very few countries have adopted binding targets. It's because we're not asking that real question. We're focused on the science fight when we should be looking at the policy. What does the president know about the science fight anyway, or Mr. Romney? Really, I mean, if they had a survey physics class, I'd be shocked.
I just want to, Dina, you probably know what was actually said since you endured all those debates, but I would pose the science question in a way, and I think it should be posed, that Huntsman did. I mean, didn't he say, if you have 7 doctors and 6 of them say you have cancer and 1 says you don't, do you believe the 1? I mean, I think that's a great way to pose the science question in terms of risk, in terms of whether something should be done about it. So I just wanted to add that.
Of course, look where it got Mr. Huntsman.
I'm just wondering if I could ask Mr. Deans to address the same question that Mr. Green.
Sure. No, Alana, I think one of the frustrating things that we've experienced over the past 18 months has been polarization is one thing. I think it reflects as much who we are as a people as it does our politicians. I think that it is, Jefferson was right. We get the government we deserve, and we are the ones who are being polarized because, and part of the reason is that the dissolution of the traditional news media has been replaced increasingly by partisan news media, which is driving this divide exponentially wider. And it's a problem. But the real problem is what Don alluded to earlier, when we can't agree on the facts. And so I think I would ask the candidates, actually, and I think you have a good lead-in with that with President Obama, that you promised 4 years ago to change the tone here in Washington. Do you believe you have succeeded? If not, why not? And I would ask Governor Romney how he would propose that we establish a baseline of agreement on the facts before we get into the political fight. Because we have always disagreed as Democrats and Republicans on how exactly we go about protecting our environment while still maintaining prosperity. But we have not had a situation where one party absolutely refuses to even discuss it and who views compromise as betrayal. That's the new ground we are in now. And Ken's colleague, Norm Ornstein, has collaborated with Tom Mann at Brookings on a new book that's going to lay all this out in about a month. And I believe it's called It's Worse Than It Looks, The Dysfunction in Congress. I love the title. Commend it to you all.
But you know, part of this is our responsibility If you look at the last 3 presidential debates, one of the reasons why we're having this dialogue, and I'm so impressed that Dina's leading in it, is because these questions have not been asked. Look in mind the presidential debates of the last 3, and you're going to see very few questions in the area that we're talking about, and even less good answers. And so what we're talking about right now is you and trying to have something that actually has these questions asked, because even the questions have an impact, and some of that is our responsibility.
Just to try to build on what Bob Dean said, maybe an interesting way to ask your question would be to ask what issues in the energy and environment area do you think Democrats and Republicans could work on together? Because one of the fundamental problems with the American political system is you can't do things with just one party. I mean, you may think Republicans are all evil and so on, but fact of the matter is that when the Democrats had both houses of Congress and the presidency, they couldn't get it done. So the only thing, I mean, that's the way the framers built the system, for better or worse. And so really the key question for making progress is, where are the areas where Republicans and Democrats can work together to make things better? And there are some, but because of some of the news media and some of the things that people have talked about, we tend to focus on the things that divide us rather than focusing on where are those areas that we actually could make some progress on.
And one last point, which is I think you could crystallize that question down by asking both candidates, saying, will you walk back your rhetoric? Will you stop with the climate deniers and you stop with the eco-fascists? All right? Do you pledge right here, right now, not to use the phrase climate denier as in a Holocaust denier, and will you not use, eco-fascist? You might actually start to mend things.
That will destroy polarization completely.
Yeah, that's right. They'll be singing Kumbaya in a second.
Exactly right.
Purple tie. Question.
Thank you. I think that I wanted to bring up the subject of discounting, and I think it may have been implied implicitly, but there was the original wise use doctrine of Theodore Roosevelt that the current generation can do what it needs to meet its needs, as long as it doesn't impede the ability of future generations to meet their needs. You talked about 30 years, but I think that we need to look carefully at the magnitude of the changes that are happening around us. We all know that the numbers, the acceleration of the population around the world. I mean, there's no open spaces really anymore like there used to be. A world with 10 billion people on it is far different from the world of, however, was it half a billion people that happened in the 1750s, when most of the foundations of what we're talking about here, the Enlightenment thinking, were laid down. The world is a much different place now than it was back then, and the magnitude of the challenges that we're facing, I think, requires real, almost revolutionary solutions. We talk about 30 years. How about 500 years from now? 500 years from now, people living then are not going to care whether we optimized our lifestyles today so that we could have, get a marginal benefit this way or that way. They're going to care whether we actually put in place the systems and institutions and built the ideas that are going to be able to get mankind to a real new level of living, which is going to be necessary if we're actually going to survive. So I guess my question would be, are you as a president willing to take the political risks necessary in order to stimulate the United States and the people of this country to take the leadership role that they need to get this planet on a different trajectory?
No, I think it's an excellent question. I think, Jackie has laid out well the question of the equities that exist today, and what you're raising is intergenerational equities, which I hope could be formed in that question, or the larger question that somebody else asked, and that is, Mr. President or President-to-be, what will be your legacy? What will you hand off? What will people think of what you did decades, if not centuries from now?
And I mean, is there some way, just to grandstand a little less, to move the question of the discount rate into this conversation, kind of what you're talking about?
Well, I'm glad you acknowledged to grandstand a little less. I think it's very, heady sort of drug to think that one is saving the world 500 years from now. But when you denigrate these little optimizations one way or the other, I think it's important to recognize that when we waste resources, by definition, we are conveying to future generations less ability to solve problems. So it's not like I think to a certain extent there's a little bit of a false opposition built into your question, in the sense that if we waste a lot of resources now on whatever, we are impoverishing the ability of the future to deal with those kinds of problems.
That is it, guys. Time is up. I just want to thank the very distinguished panel and all of you for your questions, and thank ELI for hosting, and also SEJ. Thanks very much.
Good. Yeah, that was fun. So are you running to Georgetown?
Yes.
And you're going to be lecturing today?
Till 10:30.
Oh,
Oh, sure.